with a lot of corruption issues making the waves, especially here in Nigeria. Our next conversation will be focusing on how offshore tax havens and economic hubs have thus far failed to or shown inadequate inclination towards dealing with illicit financial flows. Recent studies by a number of global anti-corruption watchdogs have tried to make a connection between this failure and the exponential increase or the deepening of a culture of official corruption in developing countries such as Nigeria and many other African countries. Recently, a Nigerian that goes by the alias Hush Puppy was extradited from Dubai, United Arab Emirates to the United States to face charges of money laundering and internet fraud. And here, closer to home, a presidential panel last week subjected Ibrahim Mago, the suspended acting chairman of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, to intense interrogation for allegedly acquiring property in Dubai using funds recovered from looters. Joining us now from Canada to throw more light on this matter is Dr. Andrew Nevin, partner and chief economist, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Nigeria. Good morning, Dr. Nevin. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. Well, quickly, the challenge of illicit financial flow. I mean, we understand that a country like Nigeria, for example, loses up to about $15 billion per annum. I don't know whether that's exaggerated, but what is the issue? Is it national strategy at the country level or failure to cooperate on the international stage? What are the risks? What are the vulnerabilities? What needs to be done to check this major challenge, particularly to developing economies?
Thank you. A very good question. So let's start by distinguishing a few kinds of illicit financial flows. So, for example, if a company sort of overstates its invoice, so the people invoicing from abroad overstates it, then you can move money abroad, more money than you should be without tax being paid because it'll be tax deductible in the country that is paying the bill. And that is a terrible form of illicit financial flows, but very difficult to track. But in this conversation, let's focus on the sort of the gains from corruption and what happens there. So the problem with for the person who's taken public funds or taken corrupt money is once they've done it, what do they do with the money? And it's becoming increasingly difficult to in effect launder it because they want to get the money to some place that they can use it, often outside of the country. And so I think that the challenge, as you say, is both within the nation's borders, but also the international cooperation around it. And I think that Nigeria needs to kind of focus on both of these parts in order to make progress on this. But in terms of what's happened in Nigeria, I have to say that one of the innovations during my time here that it really is world class is still, I think, the leading in the world is, of course, the BVN, the bank verification number, which is just fantastic. And of course, if you read headlines about these things, I won't name any names, but you see prominent people that are sort of end up with multiple bank accounts, and they can link those flows together. And from any company that you're a director, and that's been a fantastic tool for the corruption issue within Nigeria. The question is for these illicit financial flows, how to get more international cooperation to be able not only just to try to get money back, because we know how difficult that is with Switzerland and the UK and the US, but in fact to prevent the flow in the first place.
Thank you, Mr. Nevin. Dr. Nevin, but I wanted to take you to this United Nations report that was really exhaustive, looked at illicit financial flows from 1980 to 2009 and the trillions that Africa has lost. It's really staggering figures. But there's a part that really interests me here, saying corrupt practices such as bribery and embezzlement constitute only 3% of illicit outflows, whereas drug trafficking and smuggling make up 30 to 35%. But it is commercial transactions by multinational companies that make up 60 to 65%. How do we begin to address this? Because when we think of corruption and illicit financial flows, we do tend to think in terms of looting from government officials and stashing it abroad. But according to this report, that's not the case. That's 3%.
Right, exactly. So I began by saying distinguishing between the different kinds of illicit financial flows. So what the 60 to 65% is a bit what I described before. So you have a multinational I won't name any of them, but you have a multinational, and obviously it's legitimate for the multinational to charge the local Nigerian operation something for what it provides: intellectual capital, perhaps some inputs, the brand name, the trademark, support for marketing. The question is whether. Sorry, let me make sure the camera. The question is whether that's a fair number, and doesn't overcharge. Because of course, at the just a little accounting here. If the local entity pays, let's for the sake of argument call it $1 million to the parent for some purpose, that $1 million gets deducted from the income tax payable by the local entity. So obviously, if the global entity can house its sort of, let's call it central part in a low tax jurisdiction, and then build the units in countries as much as possible, it's going to minimize its tax bill. And effectively, that's what the UN is referring to, one of the forms of these illicit financial flows. So in this area, I think that Nigeria actually has quite a good comprehensive law, and we obviously as PwC have done a lot of work in this with both sides on transfer pricing between these entities. But I think the only way forward with transfer pricing is to make sure that there's always enough scrutiny of it. I mean, a company needs to justify, why is it charging $1 million for this licensing fee? Why is it charging this amount for an input that has to be imported? Why is it charging this amount as a management fee? And those things need to be challenged by the local government officials, tax officials. And of course, what it means for the tax officials is they need to have a very high level of knowledge of what's appropriate, how accounting works, how a business operates, what's a reasonable level of fee for something like that, and continuously be challenging them. But you're exactly right, is that UN report said the what looks legitimate is actually a bigger illicit financial flow than the illegitimate. The other way that you can have an illegal financial flow, I think, is just another example of this is when you misstate how much is in a shipment. So, for example, in Nigeria, quite often what happens is that someone will import, they'll say they import a certain amount, but they're actually importing in the container is a larger amount that they've imported. So they'll pay the duty on the smaller amount, and won't pay the duty on the actual physical quantity that's been imported. And of course, that's an illicit financial flow because the duty does not end up going to the government. So there's a number of ways that large companies, multinationals, can affect these illicit financial flows. Another way, of course, is if you are a natural resource economy and you owe royalties to the government. So say you're a Zambian copper producer, not to pick on them, but as an example, if you find ways to understate what you are producing, so you're paying royalties on 1,000 metric tons, but you're producing 3,000 metric tons. That's another form of being able to get these illicit financial flows at a corporate level.
Andrew, I'd like to ask, how do we, block these loopholes? And I also want you to talk about tax havens. There were some top Nigerian politicians that were mentioned a couple of years ago when the Mossack Fonseca incident came to light. How do you get monies like that back home? How do you block these loopholes?
Right. So, I mean, it's obviously not easy, but I think that the way, if you think about it for a minute, if you have a bank account somewhere, it's not useful unless you can move those monies somewhere else. So you have money in a bank and then you want to be able to then buy a property with it. You want to be able to spend with it, buy cars, buy investments, right? So the way the world has to go is, and we're moving this direction, is that there's more transparency in these movements of money. And the leading global banks are, trying to do the right thing. If you look through them, you have very high KYC. You have something called common reporting standards, which is now Nigeria is a part of. Those on this who are watching today who have a foreign bank account will know that you're asked, where you're a resident, where you're paying taxes, and there's an exchange of information on that. So that net is tightening up in the banking system. So the issue then is, for banks, and I won't name any, but banks that refuse or are reluctant to enter those sorts of levels of KYC in some of these tax havens. I'll name one because it's well known, someplace like Panama. What has to happen is globally, other banks need to stop cooperating with those banks. So then what happens is that someone who has an illicit financial flow or corruption money they've taken out of the country, they've put in a Panama bank that's not one of the top world banks. That money, in a sense, becomes flows in there. That's the direction. The other direction is certainly for Nigeria, I think, there are clearly markets where Nigerians with who diverted money, they want to end up. They want to end up in Dubai. They want to end up in London, in particular. In some cases, the United States. So I think there's a high level of cooperation needed between the Nigerian government and certainly those jurisdictions. And if we take the UK for a minute. And there have been a lot, and I think the UK government acknowledges this, there have been a lot of enablers, not necessarily the biggest banks or brokerages, but property agents who have facilitated turning these assets this diverted funds into hard assets. And so what the UK government brought in a few years ago are these unexplained wealth orders. So if you have an asset, particularly a housing asset, and you can't explain the wealth, they can come after it. And there have been a few high-profile cases on it, particularly I think I may have this incorrect, but I believe the wife of the ex-governor of the Kazakh Central Bank, for example. But please correct me if I'm wrong. But I haven't seen this unexplained wealth order used particularly for Nigerians, and I'm a bit surprised about that. That would be something that would be a discussion between governments, the Nigerian and the UK. But if Nigeria was really serious about clamping down on Nigerians that have diverted funds to the UK, there is a mechanism now for the UK government to put pressure on. And of course, people see that the UK government is doing that. You can't buy a property in London without coming under scrutiny about where the funds came. Then people are going to have to find other places to go. But it's a question. There's no one single solution. It's just putting more and more pressure on the system so it becomes more difficult to move funds that haven't been legitimately earned. Sorry, Rufai, it's a long answer. You asked the first question. I asked her the second question. Please ask the first question again.
Okay, we'll just pass on it, and let Dr.
Okay. But quickly, still on Nigeria, you talked about strategy at the national level. Where do you think the fault lines are in Nigeria? Is it at the infrastructural end or the regulatory framework, or there are legal issues that still need to be addressed for us to be able to strengthen our national strategy in this regard?
Well, I think, I'm not an expert. I'm just someone who's lived for more than a decade, as you know, and involved heavily in the economy. But I think we can all observe, certainly from the press, there's lots of activity in this area, but there is often not a clarity around jurisdiction. There's also often not, it doesn't move very quickly through the court system. So there have been a number of bodies. I mean, obviously, the obvious one being EFCC, which faces its own challenges at the moment, set up to deliberately focus on economic crimes. But the speed at which it works is not clear. What's also not clear from the outside is whether they have the tools, the training, the resources, particularly around software, sophisticated technology that they can use to be able to pursue these cases. So the one question that I can't comment on, but I think Nigerians should think about, though, is also whether there's a political will. What is the actual political will to track this down? I mean, we all read about so many things going on, some of which are pursued, some of which seem not to be pursued. So I think those are questions that really should be put. But there's a major conference, I think, beginning today. I think the vice president's just opening up a conference on this issue in Abuja. I know it's high up on his agenda. I know when I've met with him, for example, he's asked exactly the same question about what foreign companies should do, or people even like PWC should be doing globally to help combat this. So, as I said, I think there's a combination of things that need to happen with Nigeria pressuring, and not just Nigeria, but all of Africa, other countries as well, pressuring developed market, pressuring the financial centers, and then there's a group of things internally. But despite the focus on there, I think information not clear. There's a comprehensive focus on resolving this issue in Nigeria.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Nevin. Thank you indeed for joining us on The Morning Show.